Hello, Worcester Mennonite Church, and welcome to week 2 in a year of God's story of grace. This week we have the theme of Adam's fall and Christ's triumph, and we're looking at reading the Bible through the lens of Jesus. And as we do that, we have a very interesting selection of readings this week, starting in Genesis chapter 3, the struggle for Adam and Eve of knowing more, of eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil and what that might mean for them, and especially as it is an act of disobedience and how they measure that and think about that, and then what happens afterwards as they have this new sense of their own shame and how God encounters them in that. And we have, after Genesis 3, and the struggle that then begins for Adam and Eve through that experience, the story of Cain and Abel, where through jealousy, Cain sees his brother's sacrifice as pleasing to God, whereas God rejects Cain's sacrifice, and that leads him to strike out in violence and kill his brother. So we have this trouble brewing in the early first family, the first human beings, the sense of alienation from one another and from God. And then when we get to our third reading, Genesis chapter 5, we have what in Hebrew is called a toledot. It's a genealogy, a listing of generations. And basically, it is a literary convention in the Old Testament for marking transitions in story and contextualizing what is to come and the importance of a person or an event that follows this succession of generations. And so what we have is the transition from the family of Adam and Eve, a particular focus, and then we hear a list of individuals, the genealogy from Adam to Noah. And basically what it's doing is zooming out from this particular family then to the larger families of the human race who are alive at the time, including Noah's family. And it's a way to move the story to a bigger focus and the larger struggles that humanity are experiencing, and how God is viewing that and how Noah views that. It sets the stage for that. So those are our Old Testament readings, and they give us a really helpful background to the human story as we're thinking about the Bible and the big arc, the overarching meta-narrative or large story that it tells us. And we have here this beginning of the fall of humanity, the struggles with sin and with alienation from one another and from God, and how that sets the stage for God's redemptive work, which begins obviously in the Old Testament, but then it culminates in the coming of Jesus. And so that moves us to our New Testament reading from Luke, which is about the temptation of Jesus. And Jesus is very different, even though he understands and experiences temptation like we do, and like Adam and Eve did, and all of humanity. We see in his story a different result. And so whereas Adam and Eve struggled and then ultimately disobeyed and turned from what God was wanting them to do, Jesus is able to, in the time of temptation, respond and overcome and honor what God wanted him to do. So we're starting to see this when you lay Jesus over the story of humanity. There's something new happening here. God has set things into motion that are going to bring change. And so that's when we get to our reading from Romans chapter 5, this contrast that Paul makes between the first Adam and Jesus, who is the new Adam. And interestingly, this was a really big passage in early Christian biblical interpretation, what we call the patristic writers, those writing, from after the biblical authors up until maybe even the 600s or 700s. But they came up with this term. Irenaeus of Lyon, this early Christian interpreter, came up with this term called recapitulation, which is kind of a rewinding, a redoing of human history through the person of Jesus. And so he takes the pattern that Adam had lived out and Eve had lived out, which is basically the human condition with its successes and failures, and in their case, when tempted, that struggle and the fall, and he lives out the story again in his own life, and he recapitulates it by being a human who, in a time of struggle, lives with obedience and overcomes. And somehow in, the early interpretation of this passage was somehow in the taking of that life up into himself and perfecting it and living it the right way, the redemptive way, that he creates a new possibility, a healing of the image of God that was created in each human being, which then becomes accessible to us because he has redeemed humanity's capacity to live out faith. And so when we're united with Jesus, when we're connected with him, we participate in this new way of living, this life that has come through this recapitulation. The new Adam has brought a redeemed, restored way of living and has restored and healed the image of God that is in each of us. And so that Romans 5 passage is really celebrating that victory that Christ brought in that way. And then our final reading this week is from the book of Hebrews, which points us to Jesus as our high priest who understands us and knows what it's like to struggle with the challenges of temptation and human limitations, but he also intercedes for us and prays for us as one who has lived through these things and overcome. And then he prays for us that we could participate and experience freedom, the freedom that he offers through his grace and love, that we could overcome too in our own struggles. And so these are just some thoughts to consider after the second week of readings. I hope that your experience has been good so far. I have received some feedback about the readings plan, and I'm so grateful for that. A number of people were trying. If you haven't had a chance to jump in and try yet, I encourage you, that's okay. And I invite you to just give it a try. And for those of you who are going through it, I hope that you're having a good experience, and I want to keep encouraging you as we engage with Scripture this year. I think that we're going to find a lot of insight and blessing and encouragement. And as we come together on Sunday mornings, I'm hoping that we'll be able to share some of those stories with each other, and then that can be a source of renewal for us as a community. So I want to thank you again, and until next time, goodbye.